What if the pain you're trying to escape is not the problem, but the message? Not the punishment, but the exposure? Not the end, but the beginning of something you cannot see yet? Because the moment you assume your suffering is random, you remove the only chance to understand what God is actually doing through it. And Job destroys that illusion completely, because his story begins with loss so extreme it cannot be explained by simple cause and effect, not a small setback, not a temporary difficulty, everything at once. In one day, your sons and daughters were feasting. A mighty wind swept in, and they are dead. And if you stop there, you will misunderstand everything, because you will assume what most people assume, that something went wrong, that something failed, that God stepped back. But the first lesson is this: pain is not proof of God's absence. It is often the stage where his purpose is hidden. And that is why Job's story begins in a place you cannot see. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright. And that changes everything, because it shows that what is happening externally is not disconnected from something happening internally, something unseen, something that is not about punishment, but about testing, about revealing what is real and what only appeared to be. And that is where most people lose clarity, because they measure their situation only by what they feel, by what they see, by what they can explain. And when it does not make sense, they assume it has no meaning. But Job shows you clearly, lack of explanation does not mean lack of purpose. And if you reject that, you will resist the very process that was meant to transform you, because you will keep asking why instead of asking what is being revealed. And that question changes everything, because it moves you from reaction to awareness, from confusion to alignment. And without that shift, pain remains chaos. But with it, pain becomes direction. And that is where the second lesson begins. Because if you misread pain, you will fight it. But if you understand it, you will respond differently. And that response determines what it produces in your life. You think your first reaction to pain doesn't matter, that it's just emotion, just shock, just something that will pass. But Job shows you something far more precise. Your first response sets the direction of everything that follows, not because it changes what happened, but because it determines what the pain will produce in you. And that is where most people lose control immediately, because they respond without awareness, without structure, without alignment. And once that reaction is set, everything else builds on top of it, and Scripture makes this moment unmistakable. Then Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship. Notice what did not happen. He did not deny the pain. He did not pretend it was small. He did not suppress it, but he did not let it turn him against God either. And that is the second lesson. Pain reveals your position. It does not create it. And what you do in that first moment shows what has already been built inside you long before the crisis arrived. And that is why his words matter so much. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. That is not emotion, that is alignment under pressure. And most people cannot do that, not because they don't want to, but because they have not built anything strong enough to hold that position when everything collapses. And this is where the separation becomes visible. Because when pain hits, it exposes what you actually trust, not what you say you trust, not what you believe in calm moments, but what you rely on when everything is stripped away. And if that trust is unstable, your reaction will reflect it immediately. Fear, anger, confusion, blame. And once those take over, they begin shaping your decisions, your thinking, your direction. And that is how people move deeper into cycles they do not understand, not because the pain itself is increasing, but because the response is reinforcing it. And this is why the third lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. If you lose alignment in the first response, you will spend the rest of the process trying to recover what you could have held from the beginning. And that recovery is harder than maintaining position under pressure, because now you are not just dealing with the pain, you are dealing with the consequences of how you responded to it. And that is why Job's restraint matters so much. because it kept the process from turning into something destructive, even though everything around him was collapsing. And that is where you have to confront something uncomfortable, because your situation may not be what determines your outcome. Your reaction to it does. And if that reaction is not aligned, the pain will not just pass, it will shape you in ways that make the next situation even harder to handle. And that is how cycles deepen, not through what happens, but through how it is processed. And that is exactly where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Because even if your first response is aligned, there is something else that can slowly pull you out of that position without you even noticing it. You think the real danger is the pain itself, but Job shows something far more subtle and far more destructive. The voices that surround your pain will shape it if you don't guard what you listen to. And most people lose their position, not because the situation breaks them, but because the wrong voices reinterpret it for them, slowly, convincingly, until what was once clear becomes distorted. And that is where the third lesson begins. Not all advice in pain is truth, even when it sounds reasonable, even when it comes from people who care. And Job's story exposes this with brutal precision, because the moment his suffering became visible, voices appeared to explain it, to interpret it, to assign meaning to it, and those voices sounded confident, structured, even spiritual. But they were wrong. Consider now who, being innocent, has ever perished. Where were the upright ever destroyed? That sounds logical. It sounds aligned with justice, but it is built on a false assumption that suffering is always a direct result of wrongdoing, and that assumption is what trapped them, because it forced them to interpret Job's pain as punishment, not process, and that distortion created pressure on Job to agree with something that was not true, and this is where most people collapse without realizing it. They start to believe explanations that do not align with what God is actually doing, because those explanations feel simpler, they feel clearer, they give the illusion of understanding in a situation that is difficult to explain. And once you accept the distortion, your response begins to shift, not based on truth, but based on what sounds convincing. And that is how pain turns into confusion. Confusion turns into misalignment, and misalignment begins to shape your decisions, your direction, your identity. And this is why the fourth lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. Wrong interpretation prolongs the process because it keeps you reacting to something that is not actually happening. You start correcting what is not broken. You start defending what is not under attack. And in doing that, you drift further away from what God is actually revealing. And Job's friends kept pushing this narrative again and again, trying to force his situation into a framework that did not apply. And the longer that continued, the more pressure it created, not just externally, but internally. Because now Job had to resist not only the pain, but the explanation of the pain, and that is where the process becomes heavier than it needs to be. Because now you are carrying both the situation and the distortion of it. And this is exactly what happens in real life. You go through something difficult, and instead of allowing the process to unfold correctly, you start absorbing interpretations that pull you out of alignment. This is your fault. This is punishment. This is the end. And once those settle in, they begin to define your response, and that response determines what the pain produces. And that is why this is not just about what happens to you, it is about what you accept as truth about what is happening. Because if that truth is wrong, everything that follows will be built on something unstable, and instability always leads to deeper cycles, not because the situation worsens, but because your position shifts. And once your position shifts, your outcome begins to change with it. And that is exactly why the next lesson matters even more, because even if you reject the wrong voices, there is still something inside you that can begin to speak louder than truth if you are not careful. You think the most dangerous voice is outside you, but Job shows something far more difficult to confront. The most dangerous voice is the one that rises inside you after the pain has lasted longer than you expected. Because that voice does not sound like deception, it sounds like honesty, it sounds like clarity, it sounds like you finally saying what you really feel. And that is where most people lose alignment slowly, not in the first shock, but in the prolonged tension. When the situation does not resolve, when the answers do not come, when the silence stretches longer than your patience. And that is the fourth lesson. Prolonged pain amplifies internal distortion if you do not guard what you say to yourself. And Job's story exposes this shift with precision, because after holding his position at the beginning, something begins to change, not suddenly, but gradually. May the day of my birth perish. Why did I not perish at birth? And that is not rebellion in the obvious sense. It is despair turning inward. It is the slow erosion of perspective, and that is what makes it dangerous, because it feels justified. It feels like a natural response to prolonged suffering, and most people accept it without resistance. They let it define their thinking, their words, their expectations, and once that happens, the process begins to turn against them. Not because the pain increased, but because their interpretation of it did, and interpretation shapes direction, and direction determines outcome. And that is why the fifth lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. What you say in prolonged pain begins to shape what the pain produces, because your words are not neutral. They reinforce perspective, they strengthen belief, they create a framework through which everything else is processed. And if that framework becomes distorted, everything you experience will be filtered through it, and that is how people move from suffering to despair, not in one moment, but in repeated internal agreements with what feels true but is not aligned. And this is where Job's struggle becomes real, because he does not lose everything at once. He begins to wrestle with what it means, and in that wrestling, his words begin to reveal a shift, not away from God completely, but away from the stability he held at the beginning. And that shift is what makes the process heavier, because now he is not only enduring the situation, he is reinforcing its weight through what he is saying about it. And this is exactly what happens when you stay too long in unguarded internal dialogue. You begin to believe what you repeat, and what you believe shapes how you move. And that movement determines whether the process leads to transformation or breakdown. And that is why this is not just about enduring pain. It is about managing what the pain is doing inside you while it is happening. Because if you ignore that, the process will not remain neutral. It will begin to reshape you in ways that are harder to reverse later. And that is exactly why the next lesson becomes critical. Because even if you manage your internal voice, there is still one thing that most people misunderstand completely when they are in pain, and that misunderstanding changes everything. You keep asking why this is happening, trying to find the exact reason, the exact cause, the exact mistake that explains everything. Because you believe that if you can understand it, you can control it, and if you can control it, you can end it. But Job exposes something most people refuse to accept. You are not always given the reason before the process is complete, and that is the fifth lesson. The absence of explanation is not the absence of purpose. And if you demand answers before alignment, you will resist what God is doing simply because you do not understand it yet. And that is where most people get stuck, not in the pain itself, but in the need to explain it. Because explanation gives them a sense of control, a way to make sense of something that feels unpredictable. But when that explanation does not come, or when it does not match what they expected, they begin to question everything. And that questioning slowly shifts them out of alignment, not because they are wrong to ask, but because they refuse to move without answers. And Scripture shows this tension clearly, because Job keeps searching for a reason. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? And that question is not just intellectual, it is emotional. It is a response to what does not seem fair. And that is where most people break, because they expect justice to be immediate, visible, explainable, and when it is not, they begin to assume that something is wrong with God, with the process, with the situation, and that assumption changes how they respond. They become defensive, distant, resistant, and that resistance slows everything down, because now they are not just in the process, they are fighting it, and that is what prolongs it more than anything else. Not the pain, but the resistance to what is not yet understood. And this is where the sixth lesson becomes unavoidable. Demanding explanation before obedience creates delay, because you are waiting for something that is not required for you to move forward. And while you wait, the process continues, but you are no longer aligned with it. And that misalignment creates friction, and that friction feels like the situation is getting worse, when in reality your position within it has shifted. And that is why Job's story is so precise, because even though he questions, even though he wrestles, he does not completely detach, he stays engaged. He continues speaking to God instead of turning away, and that is what keeps the process from collapsing completely, because even in confusion, he remains connected, and that connection matters more than understanding, because it keeps you in position long enough for the next stage to unfold. And that is where most people fail. They disconnect before the process reveals anything. They step out before anything changes, and because of that, they never see what the pain was actually producing. They only experience what it took from them, and that is the difference between those who come out transformed and those who come out bitter. One stays long enough to see the purpose, the other leaves with only the memory of the pain, and that memory shapes everything that follows. And that is why this is not just about what you go through. It is about whether you stay aligned long enough for it to produce something different than what you expect. You think if you just endure long enough, hold on tightly enough, stay strong enough, the outcome will eventually change. But Job shows something far more unsettling. Endurance without correction does not complete the process, it prolongs it, because the goal was never just to survive the pain, it was to be changed by it. And if that change does not happen, the process continues until it does. And that is the sixth lesson. Endurance alone is not transformation, alignment is. And this is where most people misunderstand what strength actually is, because they equate strength with holding on, with resisting collapse, with staying in place no matter what. But Scripture shows something deeper, because when God finally speaks, he does not start by explaining. He starts by confronting. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. That is not comfort. That is repositioning. It shifts Job out of his perspective and forces him to see the limit of his own understanding. And that is what completes the process, not time, not endurance, but correction of perspective. Because until your perspective changes, you will interpret everything through the same lens, and that lens will continue to produce the same response, the same tension, the same resistance. And that is why the seventh lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. God's response is not always explanation, it is realignment. He does not answer every question, he changes how you see the situation, and that shift changes everything. Because once your perspective aligns, your resistance drops, your internal conflict stabilizes, and the process can finally produce what it was meant to produce from the beginning. And this is where Job reaches the turning point. Not when his situation changes, but when his understanding does. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. That is not defeat. That is clarity. It is the moment where he stops trying to control what he cannot see and begins to align with what God is revealing. And that alignment is what allows the process to close, because now there is no more internal resistance, no more misinterpretation, no more demand for explanation before obedience. And that is what most people never reach, because they stay in endurance without allowing correction. They hold on, but they do not adjust. They continue, but they do not align, and because of that, the process stretches longer than necessary. Not because God is delaying, but because they are not responding to what He is doing inside them. And that is why this is not just about getting through pain, it is about allowing it to change how you see, how you think, how you respond. Because without that change, nothing else resolves, and even if the situation ends, the pattern remains, and that pattern will recreate the same tension in a different form later, and that is how cycles repeat. Not because the situation is the same, but because the perspective is, and until that perspective shifts, nothing else will fully stabilize, no matter how much time passes. You think once God finally speaks, once clarity comes, once you understand what was happening, everything simply returns to normal. But Job shows something far more demanding. The moment after revelation requires action that most people avoid, because it forces them to correct what they carried through the process. And that is the seventh lesson. Revelation without response leaves you unchanged, and if you remain unchanged, the process was not completed, no matter how much you went through. And this is where most people stop too early. They reach understanding, they feel relief, they finally see something they did not see before, and they assume that is enough. But Scripture does not support that, because after God speaks, after Job's perspective shifts, there is still something required of him, something uncomfortable, something that forces him to move beyond himself. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer. And this is where everything becomes precise. Because those he had just endured pressure from, those who misinterpreted his pain, those who added weight to his process, are now the ones he must pray for, not ignore, not reject, not distance himself from, but intercede for. And that is where the process reaches its real test, not in what he endured, but in how he responds after understanding. And this is where most people fail, because they hold on to what the process exposed in others. They carry resentment, they justify distance, they protect themselves from being hurt again, and in doing that, they stop the process from completing, because they are still operating from what happened, instead of what was revealed. And that is why the eighth lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. What you release after pain determines what you receive after pain, determines what you receive after it, because if you hold on to offense, bitterness, or justification, you remain partially anchored to the same place you were meant to leave. And that anchor affects everything that follows, your clarity, your direction, your ability to move freely. And that is why Job's obedience in this moment matters more than everything he endured before it, because it proves that he is no longer responding from the pain, he is responding from alignment. And that alignment is what allows the process to fully close, because now there is nothing left unresolved internally, nothing left that can pull him back into the same cycle. And this is where most people miss the final step. They go through the process, they reach understanding, but they do not act on what was revealed. And because of that, something remains open, something incomplete, something that can resurface later, not as the same situation, but as the same pattern. And that is how cycles continue even after growth, because the final response was never made. And that is why this is not just about enduring pain or understanding it. It is about responding to what it revealed in a way that closes the process completely, and without that, nothing truly finishes, no matter how much time has passed. You think the story ends when the pain ends, when things are restored, when life finally stabilizes again. But Job destroys that illusion completely, because the real ending is not restoration, it is revelation. And if you miss that, you will repeat everything even after you recover. And that is the final lesson. What you learn in pain determines whether it was random or transformational. And Job makes this unmistakable, because when everything is restored, when the losses are reversed, when the outcome finally shifts, the most important change is not external, it is internal. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. That is the difference. Not knowledge, not belief, encounter, alignment, clarity that cannot be undone. And that is what separates those who are changed by pain from those who are only affected by it, because one comes out with a different perspective, a different position, a different way of responding to everything that follows. And the other comes out with the same patterns, the same reactions, the same framework, just carrying the memory of what happened. And that memory becomes the filter for everything else. And that is why cycles repeat, not because the situation returns, but because the person never changed. And this is where the warning becomes unavoidable. Because if you go through pain and do not change, you will face it again in a different form, not as punishment, but as repetition. Because what was meant to be refined was never transformed. And that is why Job's story is not about suffering. It is about completion. It is about a process that begins with loss, but ends with alignment. So clear that nothing can pull him back into the same state again. And that is what most people never reach. Because they focus on the ending instead of the change. They want restoration without transformation, relief without alignment, and that combination does not exist. Because if nothing changes inside you, everything outside you remains unstable, no matter how much it improves temporarily. And that is why this moment matters more than you think. Because you are not just listening to a story, you are being confronted with a pattern, one that is either repeating in your life or about to, and what you do with that determines everything. Because now you cannot say you do not see it, you cannot say you do not understand it, and that shifts the responsibility completely, because once you see clearly, staying the same is no longer passive, it is a decision, and that decision has consequences whether you acknowledge them or not, because patterns do not disappear when you recognize them, they disappear when you interrupt them, and that interruption is what turns pain into transformation, and without it, pain remains exactly what you thought it was at the beginning, random, meaningless, something to escape, something to forget, and if that is how you leave it, then nothing has actually changed, no matter how much time passes, no matter how much is restored, because the same pattern will still be there, waiting for the next moment to repeat itself. And that is the line Job draws at the end, not between those who suffered and those who didn't, but between those who were changed and those who remained the same. And that line is not drawn by what happened to you. It is drawn by how you respond to it now, while you still see clearly, while you still feel the tension, while you still understand what needs to change. Because once this moment passes, it becomes easier to forget, easier to justify, easier to return to what is familiar. And that is how cycles continue, not through lack of knowledge, but through lack of action when it mattered most. And if you are serious about not repeating the same outcome again, then this is the point where everything either changes or stays exactly the same. And that will not be decided by what you agree with, but by what you actually do next.